How's it going, YouTube? Come on, today with another video. And today, guys, what the bring to you is going to be the wide formats that we're getting lately are just awful to play in. And I'm going to tell you why. We're going to be going off of a lot of my own opinions about what is going on in the game currently. We're talking a lot about the kind of back and forth between if it's good, if it's bad, and just trying to stay as objective as possible, but also just telling you how I feel about it. If you haven't checked out my sponsors over at Imperium, Dragonshield, Gem, Cloud, Riw Hobbies, and Games, Grimoire, or ChainLink, definitely go ahead and check them all out down below in the description. This was the most fair Tier 0 format we've ever had, and I know a lot of people are already just beside themselves with this point, but I do want to talk about why I think this is. This is going to tie in with the fact that these were awful to play against. So, when we played against Goki and we played against Pepe, if you went second into these decks, you auto-lost. We did not have half the outs that we do today to these decks. So if these decks just went unchecked and they just like went ahead and did their whole turn, you were losing your hand, you weren't playing the game. There's so many things that just were so wrong with these formats. You went up against these super crazy decks, and we didn't have Nibiru, like we didn't have anything at the time, which is pretty interesting. So definitely some pretty overpowered decks for what they were. When we talk about the most fair, I want to just say that fair does not always equal balanced, and that's a shout out to my Discord mod and friend Squid. I brought that up in conversation, and I do agree that there's got to be some check at some point to where you can't just get outskilled, I guess, if you want to call that, by your opponent just milling 10, right? And that's totally understandable. But this is through a scope of tier, even if you go second into the matchup, you still had a way to play, and you have so many options to go ahead and beat this deck. You also had the addition of 9 Bistrels at the time that you could main deck, that people were doing to go ahead and stop this deck. You could play Flu, you could play Exa, you could main deck Shifter. There is a lot of different ways that you could play into tier. Now, not saying that it was really objectively bad if you weren't playing tier into tier, but at the same time, you had a chance. And I think that's something that we really overlook in a lot of the older formats like Pepe and Goki, where you didn't have a chance, right? Like you played against these decks, you went second, you lost at eye roll, I'm sorry you lost. And there's this new quantifier as to what tier 0 is, and that's realistically like 30 out of 32 slots at a big event that you are now quantified as a tier 0 deck, which is definitely interesting. But looking back, I feel like these were so obnoxious where if you played against like D-Ruler, I don't even feel like that was that bad. Playing against Zoo, I thought the mirror matches were really skillful. It wasn't like super crazy. Even like tier, I know a lot of people disagree, but I feel like if you had a really big issue with tier, you probably just didn't play tier, which is totally understandable. But at the same time, another reason why I thought this format was really nice was this is probably one of the cheapest tier 0 decks we ever had. Now, planets were like 90s to 100s, but that was pretty much the whole cost for the most part. Like, even the entire Mama engine wasn't expensive. The Kelbecks, I think, were like 10 bucks a piece or so, but like not really super crazy. So overall, I thought that the deck was really nice to have in the game, not only just for the really skillful mirror matches that you got into, because at that point, like, you don't always just lose to Dwellered. I feel like that's the first thing that pops into everyone's mind. It's like, well, what happens if you get Dwellered? There's been multiple times on stream in mirror matches where someone gets Dwellered and wins the game. And it's just the way that you play the deck, the way that you can interact. And I think all that really does matter. If you play into a format like Goki, like Pepe, there wasn't a whole lot of interacting going on. It was you setting your hand down, watching your opponent do the combo, hoping they mess up, and if they don't, you lose. So it's just one of those things where you gotta take the good with the bad, and I think that having these types of formats, I completely get it. Like, these types of formats are awful. You cannot do anything except play this one deck. Not fun, right? Like, these are just uninteractable. I think that if you have a deck like tier, where there was other options, you could go second, there's a slew of things that you could side or just main deck to deal with this, I think that that's a bit better. I do like these in general, though, just the one deck formats. Personally, I think that they're really something that comes down to technical play, And it's not just something that comes from variance, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The other thing too is I actually made another slide here about the fact that narrow formats are really easy to join the game in, or at least easier. So if you're trying to teach someone how to play, it's not like they're coming in and having to learn 30 decks all at once. It's, here are the best 3 decks you have to worry about. Then you can kind of context clue your way into the other matchups that you play against, because you already know how the best decks work at the time. So therefore, you should be able to understand how the other decks work as well. And I think this is a really important factor, at least for me, whenever I'm trying to like coach or teach. You always get in these conversations about, well, there's 100 different decks, what do I play? And then you get into the other conversation of, I only have 15 side deck cards. How do I mitigate this situation? And this actually cost me a top 8 at a regional, because when you're looking at a competitive event, if there's too many decks to decide for, you have to do what we call making a concession. And that's, I'm just not going to side this type of card because I don't have room for it. And quite frankly, I'm more worried about other things. And that was a format where backer removal just wasn't real. Like, nobody really played it. And I didn't play it. And my one loss at the end of the tournament was to just a back row deck. And it was unfortunate, but my deck was built to beat the rest of the room, as there was more combo than there was control, but it was still such a wide meta that I couldn't really do a whole lot with the side. So I think that's one thing that is really frustrating to a lot of players too, where people want these like crazy diverse metas, but at the same time, when it comes down to like just playing the game, and then you figure out that you don't have enough slots and you start running into random matchups, it's not the best. Because when you go to an event and you're spending a lot of time, you really want to make sure that you have the most optimal list as possible. Now, the other response I've been getting a lot of is, the competitive pro players are just really lazy and they don't want to learn a wide meta. That could not be more incorrect than anything I've ever heard my entire life. I feel like if you're really competitive and you're studying the game, one thing that you're not going to do is just quit when there's an open meta. You're just not going to do that. We are going to say that it's really not a great format overall because there's too much to worry about. At that point, it becomes way more variance and skill. And that's where I talk about variance does not equal skill. If we're going down to like a triangle format, for example, I love triangle formats. I think they're very fun. One deck beats the next deck, that deck beats the next deck, and you just have this really cool situation where usually all those decks play objectively different, and that's why they beat each other. So there's a variety of options that you can choose from, and the different techs that you can play are usually very limited. And this is where it comes down to a lot more technical play, because you have to learn how to beat your bad matchup. And a lot of times that's catering your main deck to beat your bad matchup because your other matchup is already free. So that's like Striker and Orchest, very free matchup. And then you have Dingirsu to send like a Thunder Dragon, very solid. Or you just pass on Colossus and stare at Striker, right? So definitely a lot of very interesting things that were coming up in the formats. But I do think that it is really important to note that variance does not equal skill. If you lose to a super crazy random deck just because there's so many decks in the format, is that really something that you could have prepared for? Probably not. But if it goes down to a format where you're actually having the ability to study a format, because I feel like this wide meta that we're in right now, this isn't even a format, it's just a free-for-all. And that's something that I don't think is very good for the competitive side of the game at all. And that's one thing where when there's like 30 decks, you can't simply prepare for everything. You can't. And if you say you can, you're capping. Like, it won't work. I think that it's really important to note, like, if you are going into a competitive event, you want to do well, you're spending the money to travel, and you're really confident with your deck list, how would you feel if you sat down and played against like 9 different decks for the day? You would lose your mind because your whole deck was ready for a specific meta, and all of a sudden you're just playing against the variety pack, right? And that's just not something that anyone wants to do. I think that it's really important to note too that when it comes to deck building, I think that it's such an amazing thing to just sit down and do. I love deck building so much, but I feel like I lose a piece of that when I'm in a very diverse meta. And feel free to leave any of your comments down below and argue your point as well. Again, keep it respectful because this is a conversation that we're having about the card game that we all love. I'm just going to start deleting comments if it gets really toxic or nasty. It's just how it is. And, you know, we do see those types of comments, but at the same time, we can be constructive and we can talk about this because I feel like this is on everyone's mind. And that's why I'm making this video. My tweet blew up about this, so I figured that it was about time to actually sit down and have a chat. I do think, however, though, that these types of formats and being the triangle or even the top 5 decks just benefit the game as a whole, because you can always play anything that you want to play, but if you want to really do well, pick one of the 5 and then go into the tournament and do well. And that's one thing too, where you kind of get a broader idea of like what a meta is, and if you're teaching someone the game, they can understand how to play in a meta, which is really important. Whereas if someone were to join right now and they're like, what do I do? I'd be like, do what you want, you know, like do whatever you want. And I don't think that that's ever going to be healthy for a competitive scene ever. Now, the last thing that I heard a lot about, just so many comments about this, was siding silver bullets. Now, the number one argument, and I think the weakest argument possible, is why do you enjoy formats that you can just go, hey, I sided the silver bullet, you lose? But that's not even how the game is. Like, you can side a silver bullet for a matchup, sure. Like, in Snake Eye format, we're all siding Soul Release because we all know it's a very good card. But at the same time, it's not going to end the game. And if you think about it in a more broad sense, in a competitive scene, people side deck for people's side deck. So if they know that anti-spell is really popular, they're changing their L-Storms to Cosmics. So, like, if a lot of people are on Soul Release, a lot of people are already on Bell, so they're just going to be having Bell in their deck when they're going first. So if they get Soul Release, they can just Bell. And I think that's one thing where siding silver bullets isn't really that crazy when you play competitively and you know how to counter the known bullets that people are siding, right? So I think that this is another one that has come up quite often that I think is just really misconstrued. Like, yeah, even right now, like if you side Shifter, you're siding a silver bullet into like 25 to 30 decks that we're playing. Does that mean that it's a crazy enough meta because you're siding silver bullets? It doesn't matter what meta you're in. You're siding a silver bullet for something, right? Like, it doesn't matter if it's a narrow format, if it's a wide format, like, it doesn't matter. If you're playing Ash in your main deck, it's the same thing as being like, oh, I destroy Branded if I Ash them, right? Like, it's just, it doesn't make sense to me to say that, like, a format is decided by silver bullets on the side. It doesn't make sense. But I do hope that you enjoyed this type of video, this kind of conversation, just my raw thoughts on the game. It's really important to talk about this, though, because a lot of people get really fired up about this, but you gotta remember that we all love this game, and we're all gonna keep playing this game. But we have to have these conversations and really be able to, like, understand where everyone's coming from before we just, like, pop off on each other in the comments section, right? And I already saw it on Twitter where, like, people were just, like, blowing up on each other, and that's not what this is supposed to do. This is supposed to be an open dialogue, talking about the format, talking about the game, and I think that's really important to have as a conversation. You know, I appreciate each and every one of you. I just want to see the game grow as a whole, and I want to make sure that these types of dialogues do happen. So if you haven't already checked out my Discord, Twitch, Twitter, Instagram, or my Metafy page, definitely go ahead and check it out all down below in the description. I'll catch you guys all in the next video. Thank you all so much for the support, and I'll catch you all soon. Bye.